The Research and Development Cell of Kannur University, in association with the Internal Quality Assurance Cell, organized a public lecture program on various topics from the 12th to 23rd July 2022. The third lecture was on the topic Global Economic Challenges and India's Growth Prospects. The speaker for the day was Dr. Suresh Babu M., Professor, Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Madras.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, let me start with a very hearty thanks to the organizers for this opportunity to speak here. For two reasons. One, I think very important thing to speak to the new generation of India. Second, we can see a galaxy of speakers, and to figure in those eminent speakers, I think it's a privilege. So thank you so much for this opportunity and for this important topic on which I want to talk to the next generation of economists and social scientists. Okay, so let me start with a very brief introduction of what I plan to do today. What I plan to do today is to speak on the global economic challenges and India's growth prospects. And this is a very, very vast kind of a terrain. Yeah, I'll focus on 4 or 5 issues which are very important as far as India's growth prospects are concerned from a global point of view, as well as some of the challenges which India is facing from an internal perspective. Yeah. Okay. So this is the broad outline of my talk. Yeah, I'll set out the background. The background when I talk basically the kind of changes that have taken place in the global economy in recent years, and we need to understand that because next generation of economic policies need to factor in these changes. Then I will list out 5 global changes. Yeah, I'm talking of 5 only. There are many challenges, but these 5 I think are very important as far as India is concerned. Then I'll talk about a little bit of India's growth performance. Yeah. Just to show you a bird's eye view of how India has performed in the COVID and post-COVID times, and then maybe identify some growth dampeners. There are some possible threats as far as India's growth performance is concerned, because unless and until dampeners, we might not be able to achieve higher rates of growth as expected. Finally, I'll just conclude with some observations. Now, two caveats before I enter into the lecture. One, please remember, whatever I am speaking is not the view of my organization. This is my personal view as a researcher. So it does not belong to the government of India or organization which I represent. Second, stop me in case you have any clarification anytime. Yeah, don't hesitate. Comments and substantial things we can wait till the end, but if there are clarifications or questions, please stop me. Okay? Okay, so let me start. What is this background that I want to set out? Well, the background is this whole project of globalization. And we know that the whole project of globalization comes in waves and goes. Yeah? And historically, there have been many waves of globalization. Yeah? It is a misnomer to think that globalization started only in 1991. And we, the people of North Kerala, we have been globalized centuries back, right? Ever since perhaps Vasco da Gama landed, or with trade and other relations with the rest of the world. But each wave of globalization is characterized by certain features, and it is this set of features that actually demarcate one wave from the other wave of globalization. So what happened up to this great crisis, global financial crisis of 2008-9, was what I would call as a golden period of globalization. Why? Because during the 90s, perhaps after 1960s, for the first time, a lot of developing economies embraced liberal trade measures. Capital was allowed to flow from one country to another country. Yeah, people were allowed to move. Yeah, so there was a kind of an integration, global integration, which was taking place, which perhaps was a very strong kind of a push towards globalization after the wave of globalization of 1960s. 1960s we had a wave of globalization, and we know that in that wave of globalization, countries like South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, yeah, all these small nation states actually embraced liberal trade policies and they grew faster. After that, it is this period from 1990 to 2008-9 that marked the golden period of globalization. From 2008-9, yeah, and this is the point that I was explaining, that this process of globalization intensified in the 90s. Yeah. More and more emerging economies, developing economies embracing liberal trade policy measures. Now, these liberal trade policy measures were also complemented by financial movement, that is, capital was moving. Yeah? It is not only the commodities that were moving, capital was also crossing borders much easily. And we know that there are a lot of international institutions which facilitated such measures, like the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, etc., etc. Now, in this period, there was something that was really happening, which was a great game changer. That is, for the first time, we found that emerging and developing economies catch up in terms of growth with the developed economies. Yeah? And we know that India itself is an example. Very low per capita incomes, our per capita incomes have moved now at least to $2,000. Yeah? But also saw that a large part of Asia started to grow, right? And if you look at the global growth momentum, today the global growth momentum is dictated by Asian economies. China, India, yeah, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, all these Asian countries really now decide the global growth momentum, and this catch up perhaps occurred in this 90s golden period of globalization. But then that was a brief period. 2008-9, we saw that there was a global financial crisis. Yeah. The financial crisis engulfed the West. Asia spared a little because we had our own different kind of a financial system. We know that Lehman Brothers, 127-year-old company, just collapsed. Yeah, no one ever thought that a company which is as old as Lehman Brothers might collapse. Yeah, the West had to really undergo this kind of a perils of unbridled capitalism, right? And we find this whole process of convergence that was taking place had a kind of a halt there. Now, what has happened during this period, in this phase of globalization, is that the share of output of these emerging economies in the global output increased tremendously. Yeah, that is, to put it very crudely, the percentage of output of emerging economies in the total global output increased tremendously. Share of emerging economies in global trade also increased tremendously. Yeah, so all these economies were actually doubling their ratio of trade to GDP. Yeah, trade means exports plus imports as a percentage of GDP increased tremendously. In a crude way, it's a measure of openness, how open your economy is. Exports or imports are basically the external sector of the economy. Along with that, there was also foreign direct investment flows. Right. Now, we also find that this period also coincided with large reductions in poverty, right? When I talk of poverty, there could be a lot of debates on measuring poverty and how we define poverty, etc., etc. But if one is to use an extreme measure of poverty, yeah, we find that this extreme poverty situation in these emerging economies reduced. And this happened at a time when there was substantial increase in population in these emerging economies. Yeah. So, which means that per capita incomes of people started to grow. Yeah. To my students of economics, per capita income is the first best indicator of standard of living. Yeah. That is the total production by total population. So, you have a situation where your total population is increasing. Yeah. But despite the increases in total population, we find that poverty is reducing, which means that output growth has been phenomenal. And that is perhaps a defining feature which ended with the global financial crisis. Now, what was the change in global economy which we need to keep in mind when we talk about this phase of globalization? Well, the change in global economy which we need to keep in mind is this drastic change as far as international trade is concerned. International trade became more and more specialized. Yeah, I'll just highlight that with a very simple example. But the point is that, well, there was a kind of what we call as a two-way trade. Earlier, the phenomenon was only one-way trade. Yeah, that is, manufactured goods produced in the West were actually exported to the developing economies. And developing economies did not have much to export back to these advanced economies. So, it was only a one-way flow. But in this phase of globalization, we find that there is two-way trade. And what was the change? The change was there was fragmentation of production. Production, which was concentrated in certain regions alone, now is fragmented. Let me give you an example. Automobile industry. Yeah, we know that if there is a flood in Bangkok, in Thailand, there will be a problem in terms of automobile production in Chennai. And you know, Chennai is the auto hub, one of the auto hubs of India. Why? Because some parts have to come from Bangkok, right? So, we have a phenomenon where there is globally distributed production. Production is fragmented now, which has really impacted the trade, and trade has become a two-way trade now. Now, why am I highlighting this? I am highlighting because now there is an opportunity for developing economies to get into the global market, because the character of trade has changed. Yeah, there are a lot of difficulties to penetrate into global markets, but there is a kind of an opening up now, because the nature of trade has changed, and perhaps that is defining feature of this phase of globalization. Let me tell you another example. There is a phenomenon of offshoring. Yeah, and India is a big beneficiary of that. Our IT industry was built on offshoring. Yeah, when we talk about, you know, the success of India, we cannot actually bypass the names of Infosys or whatever, right? All these models of global production actually changed, because something was done, or a part of the software is written somewhere in the world, another component is written somewhere in the world, then there is integration that is taking place somewhere else in the world, right? So, this offshoring activity then actually changed the character of production and trade in such a way that, well, this advanced economies could actually deploy their technologies in developing countries. Developing countries had their cheap labor, and that is the classic example of our IT industry success, right? So, you have a set of countries which were generating advanced technologies. You have another set of countries which have the advantage of cheap labor. When they come together, well, then global trade and output is increasing, and that is exactly what happened in terms of this golden era of globalization. But the advantage which countries like India, what I would call as late industrializing countries, was that you could actually bypass the earlier barriers of industrialization. Earlier, when we started, if you remember, our Nehruvian vision of industrialization was very, very deep industrial base. Yeah, steel, iron ore, large industries kind of a thing. But with this kind of a model of production, there is a possibility that developing economies could bypass that model and still have higher rates of growth and higher per capita incomes. Okay, now this background is very important for us. Why? Because this background is changing, and that's a worry for us. Why? Because recurrent financial crises, yeah, not only in terms of, you know, Asia, Latin America. Of course, let us not talk about Africa. Africa is a market for whatever produced goods and a raw material source for us. But Europe, large parts of Europe in terms of recessionary trends. Yeah, Asia now, again, slower rate of growth, right? And we don't need to exaggerate this, because our neighbor Sri Lanka itself is in deep trouble. Nepal is in trouble. Bangladesh barely managing because they have a deep textile industrial base, right? Pakistan and Afghanistan on the verge of collapse in terms of economies, right? So, we find that recurring financial crisis has marked the end to what macroeconomists call as the period of great moderation, because, well, now we are entering into a phase of deflated expectations. Yeah, because there is a general pessimism now as far as global economy is concerned, and the post-COVID and Russia-Ukraine crisis has really accentuated that. And we find that there has been a kind of a pulling down of the global output trajectory. So if you plot the global output, there is a trend in global output. The trend output has been pulled down because of this recurrent financial crisis, and what it has led to is a kind of a dampening of global growth path, and we are now in an era of diminished expectations. Yeah, don't think that I am sounding very pessimistic. I'll show when I come to India, I'll be very optimistic. Right. So this is the background. Right. Okay. Now, against this background, I'm going to highlight 5 factors that might affect India's growth prospects and global growth prospects as well. Number 1, China. Yeah, and perhaps if we start talking about China, we need a separate lecture on China. Why? Because there's so much to talk about China. China is always a mystery for economists as well as social scientists. Forget about technologists, right? What we find is that in this era of rebalancing, when I talk of rebalancing, 90s onwards, yeah, to 2008 period, lot of developing countries emerged, but one economy stands out among them, and that is China. China's GDP growth was phenomenal, enormous increase in the rate of growth. Yeah, we might have problems with statistics from China, and we can say the statistics is not reliable, all that is fine. But at the end of the day, when we look at their per capita incomes are very high. One. What is the evidence of that? In 1990, China was the 10th largest economy in the world, and now it is the 2nd largest economy in the world. So what am I highlighting here? What I am highlighting here is that there is a new player which has emerged from 10th position to the 1st position, and the actions and reactions of this player now are going to shape the global economy's fortunes in a big way. We'll see the examples of that. Yeah, but China also gave us a model. The model is that, well, there is a pattern of international production, yeah, cheap labor, low technological base, or what a lot of people dismissed in the early part as shallow technologies, not deep technologies. Now they have become deep technologies. Yeah, and this has given opportunities for other developing countries, right? Now, the macroeconomic effect of China's emergence was that globally there has been an increase in savings. Yeah, so if you look at the global savings availability now, yeah, earlier we were depending on Europe as well as United States. Yeah, but now we find that it is Asia that is providing global savings. We know Japan. Yeah, India's bullet train project is financed very liberally by Japan. Why? Because Japan is facing a savings glut. They don't know what to do with their savings. China is also having a lot of savings, and what China has done is that China has invested it within their economy, and they have built excess capacities, which is a problem in the future, which might actually collapse at some point. But the point is that there has been an enlarged pool of global savings, so global fund flows became very easy. Large scale financial flows became a major phenomenon in this phase. But what is the threat that I am talking about? The threat, as you all know, is this continuous tensions between US and China. And we find that from a period of free trade, from a period of trade liberalization, we see a period of protectionism now. What do I mean by protectionism? Well, every country wants to protect their interest in as far as trade is concerned. India wants to protect India's interest. China wants to protect China's interest, and United States, under our famous earlier president, really pushed their interest. Right? Now, we find that United States and China clashed quite frequently. Yeah? In terms of especially one factor which is affecting global growth to some extent, that is high tech products. Yeah, earlier the movement of high tech products were much more liberal, but ever since this kind of protectionist trade policies became prevalent, we find that high-tech products are now becoming a problem. Very small example of that, if it is not a high-tech product, but find that there is a global chip shortage now. Yeah? There is a problem as far as semiconductors are concerned. And what is the impact of that? In Chennai, we cannot produce automobiles without semiconductors, right? Chip shortage is affecting them. So this is becoming a major problem, which I think I would say that this relationship between US and China is one of the defining things that will continue to consume us for several, when consumers, we will be discussing about it for some time. Yeah, because this actually marks the end of the earlier golden era of globalization. Okay, that's point number one, the issue China. Number two, well, we also are now facing a different set of discussions. One, centered around social tensions, and the villain of social tensions, inequality. So we find that, especially in the post-COVID world, inequality is elevated. Yeah, I'm sure my younger friends who read newspapers would have come across this whole debate in India that India's recovery is U-shaped, V-shaped, K-shaped, right? And K-shaped is very interesting because K has got two arms. That is, the rich are growing richer and the poor are becoming poorer, right? And that is exactly the problem in terms of inequality that we are facing now, right? Social inequality has become a persistent and serious problem across the globe. Europe is struggling with the whole movement of, war affected people from Ukraine to Poland to Hungary, up north up to Sweden, right? Latin America inequality levels have increased. Oil prices have really affected that. I'll come to that in a minute. Yeah. So what is the problem with this inequality that I'm talking about? The problem with this inequality is that this gap between the upper income and middle to lower income has been growing. So it is a K-shaped kind of a thing. Now, lower income population has been growing, which means that there is a kind of a hollowing out of the middle class. From the middle class, yeah, I'm talking about a global point of view. From the middle class, some are able to move up, but a lot of them are actually falling down. And that is precisely the problem in terms of lower income population growing, which means that our production, our consumption, our savings, everything will be affected by this levels of inequality, which I would say is a major threat as far as global growth, as far as India is concerned. Let me tell you one example and I will move on to the next issue. That is, in 2019, black Americans held only 1/6 of the income. It's not a politically correct usage to use black Americans, but I'm using it from an earlier research. We find that they have 1/6 of the income of what the other counterparts, white Americans, had. Yeah? So that's a kind of a stark inequality that we see. In the same society, one set of people having very high levels of income, another set of people having very low levels of income, that is really, and they are earning only half of what the others are earning, right? So what is the way out? What is the way out is nothing but we need to have very, very socially responsible policy leaders, yeah, to alleviate this problem. And perhaps I think the world is looking at it now. And that's why we have numerous, G7, whatever meetings, wherever possible, in terms of whether we can get any commitment in terms of reducing these levels of global inequality. Third issue, which all of us face every day now, is the issue of climate change. Yeah, and I don't think I need to exaggerate this. Yeah, we are all facing it now. We have in Kerala the kind of a phenomenon that we never used to have, what is known as an extreme rain kind of a thing. For a few, whatever, minutes or hours, there will be an extreme rain kind of a thing. Now, this is actually, earlier it was perceived as a threat by one group, developed by another group. Okay, let me put it differently. Earlier discussions on climate change was always a blame game. the developed countries blamed the developing countries because they say that, your cooking, method is not correct. You are actually using firewood. You are contributing to CO2. And the developing countries always blame the developed countries. They say that you are using more automobiles, right? And your per capita consumption of fossil fuels is very high. And that is what is creating pollution and CO2 emissions. But now there is a realization that this is a problem which all of us have to face. No one is spared of this. And what is it leading? Well, I think what is going to change the world in the next 75 years is going to be our collective response to this. Now, who will respond? How can we respond? What are the mechanisms through which we respond? All of that will have very important implications as far as global growth is concerned. Now, this does not need any further discussion because we are seeing this kind of extreme heat as well as flooding simultaneously happening in the same countries, right? So, the problem with climate change is one important thing that, well, this is going to face a huge kind of a policy response from companies, institutions, right? And we need to think about more sustainable business models. So what was actually profiteering until 10 years back is no longer a good business model, right? Today I was actually coming to the airport and I was coming in an electric car. So when I reach the airport, I get a message, you have saved so much of carbon footprints today, right? And not very expensive. Yeah? Otherwise I would have paid around, for 380 rupees, and this came to 390 rupees or whatever it is, 400 rupees around that. But the point that I want to emphasize is that the business models that developing economies had now will have to be reworked. And I would say that this is just the beginning of a change. Yeah? We are going to change our business models tremendously. The ways in which industries have been run, organization of industries, everything will change, right? What will happen parallelly with this climate change is also energy transition that is going to take place. Yeah, India has pledged that we will reach zero carbon by so and so year. A lot of countries have pledging, right? But this energy transition will have an impact on transportation, agriculture, manufacturing, everything. So our future growth then is also a function of the kind of energy transition that we are going to choose. Fourth challenge, food shortages, which is of an irony now, because we thought that we solved the food problems, yeah, but it has resurfaced now. We find that food prices are record high globally, right? And it is actually driving millions of people to extreme poverty. So why am I emphasizing this? I am emphasizing this because the earlier point that I made, that in the golden period of globalization, a lot of people actually were lifted out of extreme poverty. Now they are all falling back to poverty, and that's a big challenge. So it is actually threatening to erase the hard-won gains of development that we had, our decades of hard work, because of just this non-available input. Now, it has great impact on the low-income people, and I don't need to exaggerate that. That is a reality, and we see that every day now. And we find that in the global hunger levels, yeah, we find that it is really by the global report on food crisis in 2022, we find that nearly 40 million more people, yeah, have been added to this situation of extreme hunger now, yeah. And we find that there are, issues related to both conflicts as well as insecurities that have been identified as a major kind of a problem as far as food is concerned. So the point that I want to emphasize here is that an issue what we had solved now is resurfaced, which means that we need to really identify resources for tackling this food crisis. Just to highlight the intensity of food crisis, because this is not widely discussed now, because we thought that we have crossed fridge, but we have not. World Bank is 83 countries shows that significant number of people are running out of food, right? Number one. Number two, there is an outcome of this which will have an impact. That is, if you have reduced calorie intake, your nutrition levels are compromised, right? And your health is actually compromised. What is going to happen, or the impact of that, will be on children, basically, because their cognitive development of young children will be affected. And that is precisely the reason why UN is so worried about this. Yeah? So there is a problem which might linger in the system, and that is due to food crisis. Finally, point number 5, the inflationary pressures. Yeah? And this is also related to the food crisis issue that we see. I'll just go a little fast here, because we find that a lot of emerging economies, prices have increased. That is an inflation of more than 5%. Yeah? Which we thought was a tolerable level of inflation until recently. So we find that there is a sudden jump in inflation globally, yeah, and we find a lot of emerging and developing economies have fallen to this inflation trap. Okay. Now, just one point I want to highlight here. 78 of 109 emerging, these EMDs are emerging markets and developing economies, yeah, they have inflation rate of more than 5%. So globally there is an increase in prices. Now you can understand the cocktail: climate change happening, food shortages, and inflation. Yeah. So this is the background that I want to portray when we talk about India's economic growth. Okay. Now, given this, yeah, this I will skip because this same point. How is India doing? This is the first wave of COVID-19 pandemic, and we were shrunk by the pandemic. Yeah, just to give a comparative perspective, this is the peak of the pandemic, right? Indian economy shrunk the most, minus 23.9. Yeah, and if you look at China, yeah, China is plus 3.2. So if one to really think about the origins of virus and things of that sort, one can have a lot of stories around that. But the point is that the peak of pandemic, we were hit very badly. Yeah, Indian economy has never witnessed such a kind of a negative rate of growth since independence, and this was the biggest kind of a loss. Okay. Let me put it in a slightly different way. Not only economic, but also in terms of debt, we had a very, very major kind of a crisis. There's a huge debate between WHO and Government of India as to how to count the debt. I don't know whether that debate is a worthy debate, because yeah, what it leads to is a different thing. But look at COVID deaths per billion population, yeah, and where does India stand? Yeah, and where does China stand? Please remember, this is pertaining to only that peak wave of COVID, right? Not only that, other countries perhaps did remarkably well. Vietnam, for example, had a positive rate of growth, right? And Vietnam I am singling out because Vietnam is a threat for India as well as global trade is concerned, right? Now, so that's the recent growth kind of a thing. Let's look at India's growth from a slightly long-term perspective. Let us take it from liberalization onwards, 91. Yeah, the major economic liberalization onwards. Well, average 7% growth we have been able to grow. So that's a remarkable rate of growth. On an average, if we have been able to grow at 7%, phenomenal, because please remember, we were actually called as the Hindu rate of growth. Why? Because whatever we did, we had a rate of growth of 3%. So economist Rajkrishna termed it as the famous Hindu rate of growth. Now 7 is double that. So something has changed. But look at this, and this is the worry. From here onwards, growth momentum we have lost somewhere. Yeah, one can actually have debate as to what led to such a situation and things of that sort. But we find that on an average, the growth rates has been very high, but we are losing the momentum in recent years. Let me show you the figures for the most recent growth scenario. This is for March, April, May, June, yeah, and we are in July. July figures are yet to out. What has happened is that now global growth momentum is actually losing out, but India is able to hold on. Not bad. So we are not doing that badly, even with all these problems that I highlighted. Yeah. For example, if you look at United Kingdom, a very interesting economy, with whom we can compare also, because they are going through a lot of turbulence at the moment. Yeah. March growth rate, yeah, April, May, June, successive months of decline, and we are able to maintain more or less same, yeah, which means that of late things have stabilized. We are rather coming out of the COVID crisis, or we have come out of the COVID crisis, but too early to predict. This only last 4 months data, but there is some momentum that we are able to gather now. But this momentum that we have gathered, we have to see it in light of the global growth projections. Yeah, this is a world economic output. I'll show two projections of them, January projection and April. January projection was very optimistic. That's what I wanted to show. I will not go to the details of the numbers, right? And this is for emerging market economies. India's growth projection was also very high among the emerging market economies, right? China's was not very positive, but this is January, and then came the Ukraine-Russia war, right? And we find that, well, Russia is supplying around 19% of world's natural gas, 11% of oil. Energy prices jumped alarmingly because of the war, and that's why I was talking about this high inflationary pressure. And we find that suddenly this growth projections, yeah, come down. I'll go to the next slide. Yeah, this is the April projection, and for India now it has come down to 6.9 from close to 8%. Yeah, which means that, well, there is some turbulence still in the global economy, which might actually pull India's growth down. And the projections for 23 is, even lesser, which means that we are going to enter into a phase where we might not witness very high rate of growth, and we need to be prepared for that. Okay. Now, I'll skip this. This is very, yeah. What are the growth dampeners that we are talking about? Inflation in India is very high now. Yeah, we are actually facing very high levels of inflation. Whatever way you measure inflation, be it in terms of the consumer price index or the wholesale price index, we find that consumer price index inflation is moderate, but wholesale price index inflation is very high. So we are so that actually takes us to different set of questions. What is the RBI's Monetary Policy Committee doing? What is the inflation targeting that RBI has been talking about? All these are very, very important issues. Whatever said and done, there is a problem, and part of the problem is due to energy costs. Second, there has been capital outflows that has been happening, which is not a positive thing as far as India is concerned, because we have been capital receivers. Now, global financial entities are slowly moving out, yeah, to other parts, which might affect our future rate of growth. So that's one important thing which we need to tackle. Third, the current account deficit. What is the current account deficit? Current account deficit is in the balance of payments. The trade deficit is the difference between your exports and imports, right? Plus your so-called invisibles. Invisibles I am highlighting because our software exports come under invisibles, right? So if your trade deficit, that is your merchandise trade deficit, if that is high, if your invisible software exports is high, means that will actually compensate, right? But it is not happening. So the current account deficit, yeah, which was 0.8% of GDP, now has increased to 2.7. That actually contributes to some bit of a macroeconomic instability, which we will have to tackle, right? So this higher trade deficit and inflation along with capital outflows is something that has really been a. But then there is also another point, which I want to highlight. That is, there is also a slight worry about some debt crisis. Although we put up a brave face and we say that Sri Lanka is a different model and we are a different model. If you look at India's interest payments as percentage of GDP, it's close to 5% throughout. Now, why am I highlighting this? I am highlighting this to drive only one small point. That is, India's expenditure on healthcare still is not 5% of GDP. But India's interest payments is 5% of GDP. Is that if we had these resources, we could have utilized for our education and health, for building a better India perhaps. This is a matter which we need to have immediate policy attention, and restructuring this debt and bringing down this interest burden is something which we will have to worry of. But why is this debt increasing? Well, this debt is increasing because the government is not able to generate revenue and it is spending. So please remember, for any government that cuts its expenditure will become unpopular. Right? We don't like governments which cuts our expenditure. I don't like a reduction in my salary, whatever said and done. Any government which is actually increasing taxes will also become unpopular. I don't want to pay higher taxes. Right? So governments are really caught in that sense. Right? On one hand, they can't cut down expenditure. On the other hand, they can't raise revenues also. So where will you find the resources from? That's a problem for the government. Right? What has happened in India over a period of time, and I am taking a very long time series here from 1980 onwards, 40-year period, we find that total revenue as percentage of GDP has increased merely by 1.5 percentage points. That's not, the capacity of the government to generate revenues for expenditure is not very high. We really need to improve that if we want to really maintain the growth momentum. So that's another dampener. We talk about government expenditure. Roughly, government expenditure is 26 to 27% of GDP. Now, please remember, I am doing a small trick here. I am standardizing everything as percentage of GDP. In absolute numbers, this is very high. But if you want to compare over a period of time, you need a denominator. So that's why I am taking it in terms of GDP. So all these governments which have been promising of big programs and things of that sort, and their expenditure, at the end of the day, we see that it's around 26 to 27% of GDP only they are spending. So you have a problem now. Your mobilization efforts are not good enough. Your expenditure is constant. Then definitely you will end up in a debt situation. Where is this expenditure going? 85% is going on new expenditure. Salaries for people like me, right? And only 15% is going for capital expenditure. Why am I highlighting capital expenditure? Because generation of growth is through capital expenditure, right? So we have a problem in terms of expenditure mix, which we need to change. Because why I am saying this is, please remember, connect to my earlier point, that is, in an economy which is facing globally climate change risk, in an economy which is going to have large scale energy transition, right, we need capital expenditure investments. We need to replace our fossil fuel mechanism with something else. All that is capital expenditure. We need to really increase this if we want to really grow at a higher rate. Final point. There is the problem of unemployment that we are talking about. We need to exaggerate this because we come across this every day in our discussions and debates. Well, COVID has hit us badly. 15 million workers lost their jobs, right? That's one number that I have put. But the problem is that half of these, in the formal work sector are doing informal work where there is so we have a kind of a displacement that has happened. People who are working in the formal sector with some social security now has been pushed out to the informal sector, and that's perhaps a COVID effect which we will have to take care of it. But what is alarming is that If you look at the ratio of employed people to the total working age population, India is very low, which means that when you define a working age population as 15 to 65, and the people working out of this working age population is very less. You find that the employment rate in other countries are very high, for example, Bangladesh or Vietnam or other places, which means that they have been able to generate jobs. But there is only one worry that I want to highlight, that is, now we need to look at this question of employment a little more carefully, because of the people who are looking for jobs, there is a large fraction who are opting out. Okay, let me repeat it. What is happening in India is that, people who are actually looking for jobs are now becoming discouraged workers. What is discouraged workers mean? I am trying for so many jobs, but I am not getting a job. Then I lose hope. Then I opt out of labor market. And that's not a positive thing. So this kind of a problem of discouraged workers, and that is where perhaps the government is now pushing on entrepreneurship, these mudra loans and things of that sort. But there, I think we have a big problem that we need to really tackle. So let me put it in very plain kind of a thing, words that educated, unemployed people who are looking for work, who are not getting jobs, are opting out, thinking, oh, now I don't apply because anyway I am not going to get jobs. And that's very, very sad for a society, because the social consequences are enormous for such a thing. That is one of the things that we need to tackle. Related to that is the problem of inequality. This I have touched. According to the latest World Inequality Report, India stands as a poor and very unequal country with an affluent elite. And I don't need to talk about the affluent elite. You go to our city spaces, we find the sheer number of BMWs and Audi cars have increased tremendously over a period of time, right? So we find that absolute income levels, average national income of adult population is still not very high, and we need to push that very high. For that, I go back to my earlier point that we need to generate jobs. For generating jobs, I go back to my earlier point that we need to have capital expenditure. Capital expenditure now is not enough perhaps, and for having higher capital expenditure, we need to really have higher resource mobilization. Okay, so let me conclude with this. Well, global prospects look very bleak, at the moment. We will have to come out of this, and some forecasts say 2028 or 29 or 30. But please also remember that there is something called the Sustainable Development Goals, which all countries had committed to. If we are not able to accelerate the rate of growth, our commitment to the sustainable SDGs would then be a problem. So that's a big threat that we are facing. India, I would say, is evenly poised. We are, as always, we are not doing fantastic, but we are not doing bad, because at least our growth has not been a secular decline. Of late, we have been able to really, hold on, right? But these global challenges would be a constraint for India. Immediate two constraints: one, the food problems; two, the inflation problem. That's a short-term problem. Long-term problems: the problem of climate change as well as the problem of tackling inequality. So we have to tackle two short-term problems, and two long-term problems will be very much needed to really push India's growth rate up. But then there are a lot of internal challenges which we need to address, and it's a long list of internal challenges. But then I would say that the first and the foremost thing that we need to address is the question of employment generation. The economy needs to produce more jobs. Whatever may be the kind of an economic model that we are actually adopting, unless an economy produces jobs for its youngsters, its growth rate cannot be sustained. And that's a big challenge which we will have to face. But for all of it, and to my young researchers, we need much more empirical research. And I really empirical research, numbers, and we should be confident in putting out these numbers in public domain, because then only there will be discussions and debates about these numbers. Let others debate about these numbers, and it is the youngsters of this nation that we need to do a lot more empirical research on these growth constraints, so that everyone is aware of our policies and everyone is aware of our limitations. So I'll stop here and I'll be happy to take. Thank you so much.
This session is open for discussion. Request students to please come forward.
Yes, the students should ask a lot of questions. The talk is meant for you. Problem, you can ask in Malayalam, that's not a problem. Yeah, I think we need to switch on the lights, then only they will be awake, right? Huh? See, it's like the case of investments in a crisis hit economy, right? Imagine that there is an economy where there is a crisis, and imagine that we are waiting for private investors to come, yeah? But then what happens is that no one will come, because you know that it is a crisis hit economy. So questions are also like that. Someone has to start now, then others will, yeah. Yes.
Sir, as the way you told me, like our economy is highly depending on those debt financing. In case of revenue mobilization, on the other side, in the expenditure side, we were on concentrating on the revenue expenditure side than of a capital one. So how we can predict that still an economy following on a fiscal policy change than of a monetary one? So how much effect will result on the future one? And there is any chance for a policy shift in the future? Just two questions, sir.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. So I think there is a need for a policy shift. Yeah. See, the point is that once when you have a large chunk of your expenditure as revenue expenditure, then you are not creating future growth, path for the economy. You need to have large scale capital expenditure, right? But where is the problem as far as the finances are concerned? The problem of finances are the inability of the governments to raise resources. Yeah, I had another slide which I have not put up. If you look at India's non-tax revenue as percentage of GDP, yeah, so government's revenue, we know that there are two. One is the tax revenue and the other is the non-tax revenue, right? If you look at the non-tax revenue in India has been more or less stagnant. So if you have a problem in terms of increasing your taxes and you fear that you become unpopular, please do something with the non-tax revenues, right? So it is basically the inability of the successive governments to raise resources that really pushes economies to this kind of crisis, and Sri Lanka is a classic example of that. No, India is nowhere near that. India is pretty well placed. Now, when you talk about policy shift, I think we need to move from this whole discussion from fiscal policy versus monetary policy. We need to have a combination of both fiscal and monetary policies, because the effectiveness of monetary policy are on very specified set of variables, whereas fiscal policy's effect is on another set of variables, right? So this should actually go in tandem. If one is dominating over the other, then there could be a problem. For example, if fiscal policy is dominating over monetary policy, well, that clearly shows that the whole control of the central bank is with the legislature in Delhi, but we need to have autonomy for the central bank. So we need to have both in tandem. Any terms on which you would like to have clarifications, which I have used?
Can you get an idea about the performance of different states, or like the way how the South is doing, India,
Yeah. So that's a very important thing as far as the federal setup is concerned. See, the most recent evidence on that is very striking. We have this NFHS, which is the National Family Health, and NFHS also collects some variables in terms of wealth. See, we don't have a measure of wealth as far as the economy is concerned, because nobody will like to reveal their income and wealth. So, using some indirect proxies, they have tried to compute something like a wealth of the population. And if you look at the wealth index computed with that data, it is not the north-south divide now, it is the east-west divide. The western states, and of course, the most wealthiest state is Kerala, there is no doubt about that. And this is very interesting. What they have done is, researchers have done, not that, using NFHS data, they have looked at district-wise. So, that is an advantage with the NFHS thing. State-wise, you might have some aggregation, and aggregation might actually cancel out certain things. So, what they have done is that, I actually don't have that slide, it's there in my this thing. So, if you look at the number of districts which are called wealthy, we find that in the western part of India that is high, and the eastern part of India that is very low. So, that I think is now a problem, because historically our Bimaru states or whatever it is, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Orissa, Rajasthan and Uttar Pradesh were in that central part, but now east is really becoming a kind of a problem, and that is a very, very stark kind of a division. Now, why is this happening? This is happening because to some extent the kind of employment generation in the west has been higher. For example, if you look at Maharashtra, Gujarat, parts of Karnataka and Kerala, whatever kinds of service sector employment, we find that the kind of employment generation is different. So, now we will have to tackle, so the point is, now we will have to tackle, earlier we had to tackle the north-south inequalities, now we will have to tackle east-west inequalities also, which is a major challenge as far as the federal system is concerned. Now, the problem in India is that industrialization per se is still driven by 5 states. Maharashtra, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and if I combine Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. These 5 states account for close to 65 to 70% of India's industrial output. And that is clearly a problem. We need to have dispersed industrialization. Unless and until we disperse industrialization, employment generation will also be concentrated in these states. And that we find that the migration trends also reveals. The migration is basically from the east to Mumbai and from other parts to this western part now. So, this concentrated structure of industrialization is something which we will have to break now. And it is a kind of a surprise that even the 1991 liberalization could not change this historical structure that we had.
I made a clarification that both the field of globalization, one thing. Then in the case of inflation, I think recently our Reserve Bank governor is adopting different monetary measures to control inflation, but still the inflation is going on. Then what is the solution to that problem?
Yeah, golden era of globalization, well, I would say from 1990s to 2008 or roughly 15 years. And that 15 years is the time when a lot of these developing economies embraced free market policies, liberalized trade, liberalized foreign investments, etc. Yeah, they have been able to grow. There was a minor glitch in 1997-98 when the East Asian economies had a small crisis, but East Asian economies rebounded miraculously. Within a year they came back, unlike the global financial crisis of 2008. So, for this 15 years period, we find that global growth has been very high. And that was driven by a peculiar kind of liberalization measures. I say peculiar because it was a free market oriented liberalization measures that really drove this growth. But the perils of that is a different thing. Coming to this whole question of inflation in India, well, it's quite clear that monetary policies cannot do anything when it is a food price inflation. Monetary policies can be effective only when an inflation, see, we talk about when in our textbook models, we talk about cost push inflation and what supply pull inflation or demand pull inflation. No, if it is a demand pull inflation, your monetary policies will be effective, and it works in a very simple way. I increase my rate of interest. When I increase my rate of interest, my savings will go up, my disposable consumption incomes will come down, overall demand will come down. So monetary policy is what we call, in an overheated economy, they cool down the economy. But if it is a cost push inflation, especially if it is an agricultural products or a food price led inflation, monetary policies cannot do much. No. What we can actually do is that, well, we have a good stock of food grains in our Food Corporation of India. Yeah, and we also banned the exports of wheat now. If we can actually push that to the market in a very, very regulated way, perhaps this food increase in inflation can come down a little. Monetary policies won't have much of an immediate impact onto that.
Thank you, sir. It is always a pleasure to hear you. But regarding to the answer you just gave, I just want to know, because the global interest rates are also increasing. So in tune to prevent foreign capital from flowing out, we raise our interest. So to prevent capital from flowing out, but not to for the domestic economy is having a kind of tension, isn't it? So how would you respond to that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the point is that RBI is now really, it's in a bind now. If you don't increase your interest rate, you have this problem of capital outflows that is happening. But if you increase your interest rate, well, more than this demand compression, interest rate increases also increase your cost of production, because cost of capital will increase. Once when cost of capital increases, your cost of production increase. So in fact it will act as inflationary. It will be counterproductive, and that's very crucial for an economy like India. So perhaps I think that is what RBI is doing now. They are just waiting and watching for a long time without getting into an action. No, if you look at the depreciation of dollar, yeah, over a period of time. Yesterday I think dollar has hit the record low. I did not see today's. Yeah. Well, we have some solace because now we have our currency in terms of other global currencies, be it pound or Japanese yen, it's not depreciating. Number one. Number two, the day before yesterday's announcement of RBI is very important. Now, anybody can settle import and export bills in rupee. We have provided a mechanism for that. But will people come forward and settle it in rupee? Will they abandon dollar? That's a larger question. If they do that, we are on a safe get. No?
One more question from me.
Please.
Governments are electing to spend money in any case, in the case of education, what will be the future of government supported higher education in the country? More into private? Do we have plans? You are not worried because...
Yeah. No, it's a very important issue as far as the future of a developing economy is concerned. No? See, I think there is a problem in terms of addressing the needs as well as the requirements. No? See, on one hand, we went for rapid expansion. I am not using the word mindless expansion, but rapid expansion. But this rapid expansion was not accompanied by kind of resources that were available to that. No? If you look at the new education policy also, the target of new education policy is to have 6% of GDP as expenditure, but I don't think we will be anywhere near that, and that's a big problem. Point number one. Point number two, we also have to have a kind of a graduation as far as education is concerned. No, that is, see, it is only one first step to ensure inclusivity through access. We also need to look at quality. Somewhere now we are still caught up in the first step itself, in inclusivity through access. For example, states like Kerala, access now is not a problem, geographical access or whatever it is. Now Kerala and all should move into the next phase of development, that is in terms of focusing more on quality basically. No? Otherwise what happens is that in a society the skills can have two types of skills, one high R&D related kind of thing, and that is exactly what South Korea did. Or you can have a low R&D kind of a thing, and that is what China did for a long period of time. And then suddenly China realized that, look, are overtaking us. And then they started to pump in a lot of money in higher education and R&D. India's R&D budget is 1% of GDP still. Some years we are touching 1, otherwise 0.9, 0.78, 0.8 kind of a thing. With 1%, and Korea's is 4.2. With this kind of a size of a nation, if we have to really grow, we need to really focus more on education. So this 5% that interest payments, if we manage our debt structures very well, and if we can get some savings from that, and if we can divert this into education and health, I think that will be a long-term strategy worth pursuing. Yes.
After the COVID outbreak, there was a unity among the Western nations in America and all to support India regarding production. Instead of supporting the whole thing going to China, they said we'll try to push India up regarding this. Did anything happen after that? Did we utilize it properly? That unity against China?
Yeah. See, this unity against China is a short-lived kind of a thing, no? Because Biden also now recognizes the fact that you cannot isolate China. Unlike Trump. Trump thought that we can isolate China and I can overpower China kind of a thing. But Biden's approach towards China is not very clear still. So the point is that there was a kind of a thinking that India's potential as far as drug production is concerned is, of course, we are one of the leaders in terms of pharma and drug exports. So if we can leverage on that, perhaps we can be, then that's what our slogan was, we can be the global whatever factory for medicines for the world and things of that sort. But I would say that it did not take off to that extent for a variety of reasons, because there was no unanimity as far as vaccine itself was concerned. No. Second thing, there was also something like a vaccine nationalism that started to come, no, because China started to use their own vaccines. In fact, EU did not recognize our what is that, not Covishield, Covaxin for a long period. WHO did not recognize that. So this vaccine politics started to take a different turn. Second or third, there was also this problem that our ability to ramp up production all of a sudden, no, was also perhaps a little slow in that. But I think we have other kind of a major potential that has come in terms of, basic drug formulations and other areas where still drugs and pharmaceutical industry is doing well.
China is what you call the building capital, the manufacturing capital of the world.
Yeah.
And India is supposed to be the service capital of the world.
Yeah.
Why is this gap? Why can't we push ahead regarding this thing, manufacturing?
See, India's manufacturing is a story of disappointment. Because, see, if you look at manufacturing as a share of GDP in India, the maximum that we have been able to achieve is 17% of GDP. With our Make in India program, our target was to reach 25% by 2025, which is clearly not attainable. Now, there were a lot of problems in the early phase of manufacturing. We were an inward-looking economy. The whole, emphasis on self-reliance was too early, perhaps. Instead of that, we could have looked at global technologies, etc. A lot of debates around that. But the sheer problem that really, held India back was infrastructure. To a great extent, infrastructure capacity of India still is not good enough in terms of, for example, a very simple thing like uninterrupted quality power supply for a producer. Especially for a small scale producer, an SSI unit running and things of that sort is a major problem, no? So there are a lot of bottlenecks which we are still not able to fix. Now, 75 years of independence, and if we are thinking about that, I think then we can actually overcome this in the next 25 years.
The working mentality of the Indians, are we lazy compared with Chinese?
No, I think now it is changing. Our bright kids are really working and they are hardworking. Yeah. Culture is different, and that's a very sociological kind of an issue, no? But please remember, we will overtake China in 2023 in terms of population. We will have the largest population in the world, and that's a big opportunity if we take advantage of that. Please.
Do you think that we want to set a different priority for India's development?
Well, we need to think of a totally different priority as far as our employment and inequality is concerned. Our model earlier had, we talk about industrialization, is clearly not able to deliver. 60s and 70s we talked about trickle down, but hardly anything trickled down at that point in time. 90s, this entire project of liberalization, well, there were some successes, some kind of failures, but I think now it is time that we really focus on very specific issues, and that is the lessons which East Asia gives us. East Asia fundamentally invested in two important aspects: health, education. These are the two things which they invested to. Of course, they forcefully had higher savings rate. So this higher savings rate getting converted into human capital, and they were willing to wait for this human capital to come. That's a miracle. And that is perhaps our new model which we should also think in terms of investing. And it is time for India to do that, because now by 2023 we have the largest population in the world. So it should be a people-centric, human-centric model that we need to talk about,
Wouldn't there be any control by the government regarding admission to higher studies? For example, there is no aptitude test conducted anywhere in India. If you go to UK or other places, that's very important. Somebody has to go for engineering or a medical or anything. If they get through that, then only they get admission. Here there is nothing, no such thing at all.
No, we have our own set of sets. We have JEE, we have NEET, we have central universities.
After plus 2, anybody can go for engineering or IIT or medical or whatever thing. There is no, in between there is no hurdles. If he has got the money and clout, he reaches there. In India, but not in UK or US.
Shall we, if there are no more questions? So, thank you very much, and thank you for your patient listening.